The first time the lights went out in the tunnel, I felt something moving in the black water, brushing past my leg like a hand searching for a grip. My job isn't glamorous. I repair a flooded tunnel under the sea, a place most people don't even know exists, but it comes with 11 strange rules that decide whether you make it back alive. I learned quickly that ignoring even one of them can cost you more than your life. I still remember the first time I broke a rule, and the darkness didn't stay empty. The first time I stood outside the flooded tunnel, the sound of the warning siren rattled the walls like the groan of something ancient waking up, and Clark placed a heavy hand on my shoulder as he said, "Rule 1. Never enter the tunnel unless the warning siren has gone silent." His voice didn't rise above the alarm, but it cut through it like a blade. I thought it was a safety precaution, something technical to do with pressure, but Clark's eyes stayed fixed on the black water sloshing just beyond the gate, and I knew it meant something else. His grip on me wasn't just steadying, it was restraining. I didn't understand the weight of his warning at first, because I had just been hired and everything about this job felt mechanical and routine. The tunnel itself was nothing more than steel ribs wrapped in concrete, stretching far under the seabed to house cables and pipelines that powered half the coast. Still, when I listened to that siren echoing down the shaft, I felt like the tunnel was alive, vibrating with the sound as though it was its own voice. Clark didn't let go of me until the alarm finally choked itself quiet, and only then did the gate creak open. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It pressed against my ears like thick air. I waited inside with the rest of the crew, water lapping against my knees, the beam of my flashlight cutting through a haze of silt. The walls were damp and slick, sweating droplets that slid down into the flooded floor, and the smell of rust clung to every breath. I tried to focus on my assignment, tightening bolts along one of the cable housings, but every step felt like intruding into something that didn't want me there. The silence after the siren wasn't absence of sound, it was listening, and it followed us deeper. Clark walked beside me, his lantern swinging low, and I caught him glancing back every few steps. "You think it's just noise, don't you?" he asked. His tone wasn't mocking, but weary, like he had seen too many men make the same mistake. I muttered that alarms were just alarms, nothing more, but I couldn't shake the image of his hand clamping down on my shoulder earlier. "You'll learn," he said. "Everyone learns eventually." I wanted to ask what exactly he meant, but the look he gave me, half warning, half pity, made me keep my mouth shut. The deeper we went, the stranger the tunnel felt. The water rose to my thighs, icy and restless, carrying ripples that didn't come from us. My flashlight flickered once, dimmed, then steadied again, but my breath had already quickened. The others seemed unfazed, tightening bolts, inspecting cables, muttering to themselves about deadlines. I forced myself to match their calm, but the silence bore down heavier with every step. It was like standing in a church long after midnight, when every shadow looks like it's waiting for you to blink. We reached a section where the water climbed nearly to our waists, and the tunnel curved left into a stretch I hadn't seen on the blueprints. Clark told me to hold position while he checked the readings, and I tried not to stare into the bend ahead. My light caught on something metallic bobbing just beneath the surface, and I leaned closer, thinking it was scrap, but the moment I touched it with the edge of my glove, it sank without a ripple, as if it had been waiting for me. My heart pounded as I jerked back, and in the silence I thought I heard something faintly stirring below, as though the water itself had lungs. Clark returned and noticed my pale face. He didn't ask what I'd seen, he just nodded slowly, like he already knew. "That's why you wait for the silence," he said under his breath, though he had never told me what the silence actually meant. I wanted to believe it was pressure shifts or some resonance in the metal walls, but deep down, I knew he was talking about something else, something that came with the siren, or maybe something the siren kept at bay. I swallowed hard and forced my hands steady as we worked, but the cold grip of the water stayed wrapped around my legs, tugging as if to test my balance. When the shift ended, and we made our way back toward the gate, The silence still pressed thick in the tunnel, broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling. I didn't look down again, didn't dare, but I felt the movement brush my boots like a current flowing against logic. I focused on Clark's lantern swaying ahead of me, its pale glow like a tether, and I realized that whatever rules governed this place, they weren't made by men trying to protect equipment. They were older, written into the very bones of the tunnel, and survival meant following them without question. As we stepped out and sealed the gate behind us, the siren began again, low and mournful, as if the tunnel itself was exhaling after holding its breath. Clark didn't speak, and neither did I. My clothes clung wet to my body, my gloves heavy with seawater, but it wasn't exhaustion that weighed me down. It was the knowledge that I had barely glimpsed what this place demanded. My first day taught me only one thing with certainty: the rules were not negotiable, and next time I wouldn't be so lucky standing that close to breaking them. The first time the overhead bulbs trembled and dimmed, I felt the air inside the tunnel change, and Clark's warning echoed in my mind. Rule 2. Never speak when the lights flicker inside the tunnel. The silence was already heavy after the siren, but this was different. The moment the glow weakened, the water seemed to grow darker, as if shadows rushed in to swallow what the bulbs abandoned. I held my breath and tightened my grip on the cable wrench, terrified of making even the smallest sound. My throat ached with words I couldn't let out, and every muscle in my body begged me to ask Clark what was happening. But I knew better than to test the rule. We were waist deep again, trudging forward through cold water that pulled like an unseen tide. The flicker lasted no more than 3 seconds, but in those seconds, the tunnel became unrecognizable. The reflections on the surface stretched unnaturally, rippling like figures that didn't belong to us, and I swore I saw a shape rise just beneath the waterline. When the lights steadied, everything looked the same, but I couldn't shake the image. Clark didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge what had just happened, as if his silence was its own obedience. His lantern swayed faintly, the glow steady, but I knew he had noticed the flicker too. I forced myself to focus on the work, tightening bolts, checking pressure lines, listening to the hum of machinery in the distance. But every time my flashlight beam passed over the surface, I saw those warped reflections waiting to crawl free. The tunnel groaned as though settling deeper under the weight of the sea, and the sound carried like a whisper through the walls. A part of me wanted to fill the silence, to remind myself I was still human, but the rule pinned my tongue still. My own breathing sounded too loud, echoing back as though something else had picked up the rhythm and copied it. Halfway through the shift, one of the newer recruits, Harris, broke the quiet. He was young, cocky, the kind of worker who thought rules were exaggerations to scare rookies. When the bulbs above us trembled again, their glow stretching thin, Harris laughed nervously and muttered, "Looks like the place needs an electrician." The sound of his voice spread like a ripple through the tunnel, too sharp, too alive. Clark snapped his head toward him, eyes wide with fury, but it was already too late. I watched the water near Harris stir, though none of us had moved, and a chill ran down my spine so deep it felt like my bones were freezing. The flickering ended, the light steadied, and nothing happened for a breathless moment. Harris smirked like he had proved the rest of us superstitious, but Clark didn't relax. Instead, he grabbed Harris by the arm and shoved him against the wall, his voice a low growl. "Don't speak when it flickers," he hissed, the veins in his neck straining with tension. Harris laughed again, trying to shake him off, but I noticed the water behind him swell upward in a way that didn't match the rest of the current. It was subtle, like a hand pressing up from beneath, and before I could shout a warning, the surface broke. Something pale and slick brushed against Harris's back, quick as a flash, then vanished below before my light could catch it fully. He spun around, face pale now, his laugh gone. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, but Clark only shoved him forward, forcing him to walk. None of us answered, because to acknowledge it felt like inviting it closer. My throat burned with the urge to speak, to ask what we had just seen, but the rule held me still. heavier than any command. The silence was survival, and Harris had nearly torn it apart. The rest of the shift dragged on with an unbearable weight. My nerves frayed with every flicker of the bulbs, every ripple in the water, every groan of the steel ribs around us. The tunnel was alive with unspoken tension, as if holding its breath alongside us, and I knew that breaking the rule again would mean drawing attention we couldn't escape. Harris stayed unnervingly quiet after his close call, though his eyes darted everywhere, wide and panicked. I kept close to Clark, whose steady movements were the only tether keeping me from bolting back to the gate. By the time we returned, the gate sealed behind us. I couldn't tell if I was shivering from the cold water or the memory of what had brushed past Harris. Clark didn't scold him in front of the crew. He didn't need to. The look in Harris's eyes was punishment enough. I knew then that the rules weren't made to scare us. They were warnings carved out of blood and loss, passed down to keep fools like us alive. And if Harris had any sense, he had just learned what happens when you treat silence like an option instead of a command. That night, long after I changed into dry clothes and tried to steady my hands, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale shape rising out of the water, faster than thought, disappearing before it could fully surface. I wondered what would have happened if Harris had said more. If he had kept talking instead of stopping when Clark grabbed him, would the thing have risen higher? Would we have all drowned in that tunnel without ever knowing what had pulled us under? The thought alone made me keep the lights on in my bunk, praying they wouldn't flicker. When the next shift came, the siren groaned, the gate opened, and the rules weighed heavier than ever. I followed Clark inside with my chest tight and my throat sealed shut, determined that no matter what I saw, no matter what I thought, I would never let my voice escape when the bulbs above began their trembling dance. Because down here, silence wasn't just golden, it was the only thing keeping the water from swallowing us whole. It was on my third week that Clark explained why we rotated night shifts so carefully, his voice grave as he reminded me. Rule 3. Do not shine your flashlight into the water after midnight. At first it sounded like superstition, just another quirk of old workers who had spent too long in the dark. But then I noticed how every man in the crew avoided looking down once their watches crept past 12. Their beams stayed locked on the walls and ceilings, never dipping toward the rippling surface. It wasn't habit, it was discipline, carved into their muscles like second nature. That night, I was assigned alongside Harris again, who still carried the look of a man pretending he wasn't afraid. We waded knee-deep in the tunnel, lanterns and headlamps keeping the shadows at bay. But the moment the clock on my wrist hit midnight, Clark gave me a warning glance. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. I angled my light toward the dripping ceiling, tracing the ribs of rusted steel, anything to avoid catching a glimpse of the surface below. The water gleamed faintly in my peripheral vision, a mirror that wanted my attention, and resisting it made my skin crawl. Harris, of course, wasn't as careful. He muttered that we couldn't fix bolts and pipes properly without checking for submerged damage. His words carried the edge of defiance, like he wanted to prove himself braver than the rest. I saw his beam quiver dangerously close to dipping, and I hissed under my breath for him to stop. He gave me a smirk, half amused, half mocking, but didn't press further. The silence between us was sharp, broken only by the distant groan of the sea pressing against the walls. I tightened my jaw and forced myself to look anywhere but down, because even curiosity felt like betrayal against the rule. The longer we worked, the more the water seemed to shift with intent. My boots brushed against currents that didn't belong, small pulses rolling through as though something swam just beneath us, circling. Once, I felt the faintest drag against my shin, and I bit the inside of my cheek to stay silent. My light caught on condensation dripping steadily from above, falling into the water with tiny splashes, but each drop seemed too loud, too significant, as though the surface was listening. The urge to angle my flashlight down and prove to myself that nothing was there became unbearable, but I clenched my jaw and resisted. About an hour into the shift, the pressure changed. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift you feel in your chest before your ears. but soon even Harris noticed. "Feels heavy in here," he whispered, but Clark's glare silenced him before he could say more. My hands trembled around my tools, and I realized the water had grown strangely still, too still for a space that usually rippled with the movements of so many men. The reflection in my peripheral vision didn't ripple anymore. It waited. That was when I understood the rule wasn't superstition. The water wasn't empty. It was watching us back. Harris slipped then, his boot catching against the slick floor, and his beam swung wildly. For a split second, the light cut across the surface, and I caught a glimpse of something that stole the air from my lungs. Pale faces shimmered just below, stretched long as if distorted by the water, their eyes wide and unblinking. They weren't human, not exactly, but they were close enough to make me want to scream. The light snapped away almost instantly, but the damage was done. The water stirred violently, waves slapping against my thighs, and Clark barked at us to keep moving without so much as a backward glance. None of us dared say what we had seen, but Harris's face was drained of all color, his earlier arrogance gone. He stumbled forward like a drunk man, clinging to the wall as if the steel ribs could protect him from what had stirred below. I couldn't tear the image from my mind, those eyes, endless and unblinking, waiting just beneath us like predators beneath ice. My hands shook so badly, I could hardly tighten the bolts, and every splash of water felt deliberate, like fingers brushing against my legs. Midnight was no longer a time on a clock, it was a threshold, and we had crossed it. The rest of the shift blurred into survival. We moved faster than ever, completing only the bare minimum of work before retreating. Clark's lantern was our anchor, swaying steady ahead of us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that more lights followed in the water below, pale glimmers rising in tandem with our steps. By the time the gate loomed into sight, Harris bolted first, his boots splashing frantically, until he collapsed on the dry floor beyond. Clark and I sealed the door behind us, but even as the siren began to groan again, I thought I heard the faint lap of waves against the metal, almost like laughter. That night, I didn't dream of faces, I dreamed of eyes, dozens of them, pressing close against the surface, waiting for my light to slip again. I woke drenched in sweat, gasping, and swore I heard the echo of water dripping somewhere in my quarters, though the room was bone dry. Harris refused to speak to anyone the next day, sitting in silence with shaking hands. Clark didn't scold him, he didn't need to. Whatever had stared back at us through that water had already done enough to silence him permanently. When my next midnight shift arrived, I didn't even lift my flashlight once. My hands worked blindly on bolts and pipes, and I trusted my fingers more than my eyes. The others did the same, keeping their beams locked on the ceiling and walls, every man moving with mechanical precision. None of us dared test the stillness below again. The silence stretched long, broken only by our breath and the occasional drip from above, but I welcomed it, because I knew the moment I broke the rule, the water would no longer just wait, it would reach. The first time I heard it, the sound barely carried above the steady drip of water, but it froze me in place all the same. We were half a mile into the tunnel, waist deep in icy water, when the faint rhythm of steps echoed behind us. Clark stiffened, his knuckles white around the lantern handle, and whispered just loud enough for me to catch. Rule 4. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. My stomach dropped, because every nerve in me wanted to glance back, to prove that the sound was only in my head, but the weight of his warning held me rigid. At first, Harris thought it was one of the other crew members lagging behind. "We're not alone, right?" he muttered, his voice trembling. Clark shot him a look sharp enough to silence him, shaking his head once. The steps grew clearer, slapping faintly against the water, deliberate in their pace. They weren't rushed, weren't clumsy, but steady, like someone who knew exactly where we were going. My skin prickled under my soaked uniform, and I stared at the narrow beam of my flashlight, fixed on the wall ahead, forcing my eyes forward. If I turned, I knew I wouldn't be able to turn back. The footsteps kept a perfect rhythm with ours, sometimes matching, sometimes trailing just half a beat behind. Every splash echoed through the steel ribs of the tunnel, bouncing until I couldn't tell where the sound began. Harris's breathing grew ragged, and he gripped the wall as though steadying himself. I wanted to reassure him, but the rule anchored my tongue. The worst part wasn't hearing the sound. It was knowing that whatever followed us wanted recognition, like a shadow begging to be noticed. My heart pounded against my ribs, my pulse screaming for me to look, but I forced my legs to keep moving. We reached a junction where the tunnel split, one passage curving upward toward higher ground, the other descending deeper into the submerged section. Clark raised his lantern and motioned us right, away from the darker slope. The footsteps followed. The echo never faltered. No closer, no farther, just steady as though it had no reason to hurry. I imagined something faceless keeping pace, walking with us like an uninvited crewman. Harris stumbled once, and I grabbed his arm to steady him, but the movement sent a wave rolling behind us. I swore I felt a shift in the air then, as if the thing back there was leaning closer. When we finally stopped to inspect a damaged cable housing, Clark barked at us to keep our eyes down and work fast. My hands shook as I fumbled with the tools, the metal slick under my gloves. The footsteps paused when we paused, resuming only when we moved again. That was when I realized the sound wasn't random. It was responding to us, mirroring us. Harris's lips quivered, and he whispered that he couldn't take it anymore, that he needed to know who or what was there. Clark grabbed him by the collar, his voice low but burning. "Don't you dare, not if you want to walk out of here." We worked in silence, pretending not to hear the splashes behind us, though every fiber of me screamed with tension. My flashlight beam shook across the wall, and for an instant the reflection of water rippled unnaturally, as though someone else's shadow moved in tandem with ours. My mouth dried, and I realized the footsteps weren't just noise, they were presence. The air carried it like weight, pressing harder with every echo. My jaw clenched so tight it hurt, but I refused to turn, because some instinct deeper than fear told me that the moment I acknowledged it, the thing behind us would no longer stay behind. The return walk to the gate felt endless. Each step forward dragged against my muscles, the weight of those footsteps matching ours, until I no longer knew if we were the ones leading or following. Harris muttered prayers under his breath, his voice barely audible, but Clark didn't stop him this time. Maybe prayers didn't count as breaking the silence, or maybe Clark was too focused on keeping his own head straight. My throat itched with the urge to glance back just once, to prove to myself that nothing was there, but I remembered how Clark's grip had saved me before, and I forced myself forward. When the gate finally came into sight, the footsteps grew louder, sharper against the water, as though whoever or whatever followed us didn't want us to leave. Harris broke then. He spun halfway, his beam beginning to dip back toward the sound. Clark lunged and shoved his head forward, snarling through clenched teeth. "Don't look." The light never caught what trailed us, but the water behind us rippled violently, slapping against the steel walls like hands pounding. The gate creaked open just as my chest was about to burst, and we stumbled out onto dry ground, sealing the barrier with shaking hands. The siren groaned to life, its low wail masking the absence of footsteps. Clark dropped his lantern and collapsed against the wall, his face pale. Harris sat with his back against the steel, trembling uncontrollably, his eyes wet with fear. No one spoke, because we didn't need to. The silence was proof enough. Whatever walked behind us had stopped at the gate, but it wasn't gone. It never left. It only waited for another chance. That night, when I finally lay in my bunk, I kept thinking about what would happen if one day I slipped, if I turned before the gate. I didn't know if I'd ever see daylight again, or if the footsteps would simply become mine. The first time I heard my name whispered inside that tunnel, I thought I had finally lost my mind. We were 2 nights past the footsteps incident, and none of us had slept properly since. Clark gathered us before the next inspection, and reminded us, his voice flat, that Rule 5, never respond, if someone calls your name inside the tunnel." He didn't need to explain why. His expression alone, the hollow shadows beneath his eyes, carried enough weight to keep me silent. But when I waded back into that drowned corridor, lantern in hand, and heard a voice behind me breathing my name, silence became almost unbearable. It wasn't loud, not even urgent, just a soft call, like someone standing an arm's length away in the dark. "Daniel," the voice brushed against my ear, though Clark was ahead of me and Harris further back. My entire chest locked, lungs aching with the sudden need to exhale. I didn't dare look, and I didn't dare answer. But the voice came again, softer this time, as though testing my restraint. I gripped the lantern so tightly that the metal cut into my palm, trying to convince myself that it was the tunnel carrying sound strangely. But deep down, I knew better. The rules weren't written for superstition. They were carved from survival. Harris, trembling as always, muttered that he had heard something too, though his voice didn't dare rise above the trickle of water. Clark kept walking, ignoring us both, his silence proof that he had heard it as well. My skin crawled with cold sweat, and I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to stay fixed on the wall ahead. The problem wasn't just hearing my name, it was how familiar the voice had sounded. It wasn't a stranger, it was my brother's voice, someone who hadn't set foot near the sea in years. The whisper repeated itself, growing more confident the longer I ignored it. My name stretched unnaturally, vowels drawn out until it no longer sounded human, more like air pushed through broken pipes. Every part of me screamed to demand who was there, to break the tension by acknowledging it. But Clark's earlier warning echoed louder than the whisper itself. If I spoke, I wouldn't be speaking to someone I knew. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard that I tasted blood, anchoring myself to pain, using it as a reminder that I was still here, still alive, and not to give in. When we stopped to examine the corroded joints along the tunnel's ceiling, Harris's lantern flickered, casting broken shadows across the walls. He stiffened, eyes wide, then slowly turned toward the dark behind us. I lunged forward and grabbed his wrist, shaking my head violently. His lips trembled, and I realized he had heard his own name, whispered too. Whatever stalked these halls wasn't just calling me, it was learning all of us. Clark muttered through clenched teeth, telling us to keep moving faster, as though distance could muffle the sound. But the whispers followed, calling us one by one, voices we each recognized. By the time we reached the maintenance shaft, my nerves were shredded raw. My brother's voice had become angrier, sharper, almost mocking. "Daniel, why won't you answer me?" It hissed, though no human throat could produce that rasp. Harris clutched his ears, shaking his head as if the sound were stabbing knives into him. He whimpered that his mother was calling for him, pleading with him not to leave her behind. Clark barked at him to shut up, but I saw fear crack through his face too. Whoever was calling my name wasn't just an echo, it was bait, designed to tear us apart one by one. The shaft reeked of rot and metal, the water around our legs swirling with unseen currents. The whispers grew louder the deeper we pressed in, as though the tunnel itself had learned to speak. I pressed my hand against the steel wall, grounding myself in something solid, but the cold vibration felt alive, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. When I jerked my hand back, I heard the voice again, this time closer, almost pressed against the back of my skull. "Just answer, Daniel, just once." The words bled into me, planting themselves like hooks in my mind. Clark's lantern dimmed as if smothered by unseen breath, and we froze in the thin glow. He finally spoke, voice tight with strain, telling us that the whispers never stopped, that they would keep learning our voices, until one day we couldn't tell which was real. His hands shook, though he tried to hide it, and I realized the weight of years spent following these rules had hollowed him from the inside. Still, he clung to them, because without them, there was nothing left but the voices in the dark. Harris sobbed softly, and the sound nearly broke me too, because it blended seamlessly with the whisper, and for a moment, I couldn't tell which was which. The water rippled violently, then sloshing higher against our waists. Clark urged us forward, his voice cracking as he ordered us not to stop, no matter what. I stumbled, nearly falling, and in that instant, the whisper became a scream, my name echoing so violently, it felt like it tore through bone. The tunnel shook, or maybe it was only my body convulsing under the weight of it, but the urge to scream back was overwhelming. I bit down on my tongue, blood spilling into my mouth, and forced myself to stagger forward, refusing to give it what it wanted. When we finally reached the end of the shift and stumbled back into the light near the gate, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse somehow, pressing down on us with suffocating finality. Harris collapsed, sobbing into his hands, muttering that his mother had begged him not to leave her. Clark turned away, unwilling to look at either of us, his shoulders trembling though he tried to steady them. My own throat ached with the ghost of a scream I had swallowed whole, and even then, even in silence, I knew the voices weren't gone. They were waiting for me to slip, waiting for the moment I finally answered back. When we left the tunnel that night, the silence seemed almost merciful compared to the relentless whispers. But Clark wasn't relieved. He simply stared at the pool beneath the maintenance hatch, as if daring it to move. Then, in that gravelly tone of his, he reminded us of the next law carved into our survival. Rule 6, never shine your light directly into the water. At first it seemed absurd. Wasn't that the whole point of carrying lanterns? But Clark's jaw set with iron, as he explained no further, and his refusal told me everything I needed to know. Some truths here were better left unspoken. The rule sat heavy in my mind as we gathered for the next shift. Our lamps hissed faintly with oil, casting pale circles in the dark. Harris kept fussing with his, adjusting the wick nervously, muttering that he hated how dim it seemed. I didn't blame him. The shadows stretched like they were alive, pressing too close, curling at the edge of sight. But dim was safer than temptation. Shining into the water was what the thing wanted. That much I could feel. The pool itself was different from the rest of the flood. Darker, as though ink bled beneath its surface instead of seawater. We waded in carefully, boots breaking ripples that seemed to swallow sound. Clark's instructions were curt. Keep the light angled down just enough to see your steps, never deeper. Harris tried to joke about sea snakes or eels, but his voice faltered when a faint ripple traced across the surface beside him, though nothing had moved. I glanced down instinctively, only to catch a distorted flash of my own reflection staring back. For a split second, it didn't mimic me. It smiled, teeth too sharp, eyes too wide. I snapped my gaze away, lantern trembling in my grip, my pulse hammering as the cold sweat slicked my back. We kept close, water lapping against our thighs, the tunnel walls dripping with brine. The deeper we moved, the stronger the urge became to aim my lantern downward. It was irrational, primal, like a tug at the back of my skull. Every instinct screamed that if I looked properly, I'd see something lurking just beneath the surface, something that explained everything. But the rule echoed louder, never shine your light directly into the water. Clark's shoulders were rigid, his knuckles bone white around his lantern handle, as though he too fought the same temptation. Halfway through, Harris broke. His hand slipped, tilting the lantern toward the pool before Clark barked at him, shoving it upright again. The ripple that followed wasn't natural. It surged outward from beneath, crashing against our legs, though no current should have been strong enough in that narrow shaft. Harris cursed, panic cracking his voice, and Clark hissed at him to keep walking. But I saw it, just for an instant. Something pale brushed the surface before sinking again. Not fish, not human. The water swallowed it whole, but the trail it left glowed faintly, like veins of light trapped beneath the blackness. That glow followed us. Slow at first, like bioluminescence, weaving beneath our boots in delicate strands. But the deeper we pressed, the more aggressive it grew. Shapes formed beneath the glow, long serpentine impossible angles that no living thing should bend into. Harris whimpered, and I bit down on my lip so hard it split. knowing if he dropped his lamp into the water, we'd be done. The glow pulsed, almost in rhythm with our hearts, like it knew we were watching it from the corner of our vision. My chest heaved, air choking in my throat, because every instinct screamed to point my light down and confirm what I was seeing. Clark whispered then, not loud enough for the tunnel to carry. He told us that once, years ago, a welder had broken the rule. Just a second, Clark said, voice shaking. That's all it took. His body surfaced later, washed against the steel bulkhead, every bone twisted out of place. His face locked in a grin so wide it split the flesh. Clark's jaw quivered, but his eyes stayed forward. I understood then why the rule existed. Light wasn't protection down here. It was an invitation. The glow sharpened beneath us, tightening into a lattice of lines, like a net being cast upward. Harris squeezed his eyes shut, whispering his mother's name under his breath. I wanted to scream at him to stop, afraid the water itself was listening, but my own throat locked with terror. My boot caught on a jagged pipe, and I stumbled forward, lantern tilting dangerously. For one breathless heartbeat, its beam caught the surface directly. The water answered. It wasn't a splash, it was a roar, a surge of pressure that blasted against us as if something massive had stirred beneath. The glow expanded, blinding for a moment, and I swear I saw faces, hundreds of them, pressed against the underside of the water like glass, mouths open in perfect silence. My lantern jerked back upright, and the glow vanished instantly, retreating into blackness as though it had never been. My knees nearly buckled, and Clark shoved me forward with a snarl, forcing me to keep walking, muttering that if I slipped again, it wouldn't let go so easily. When we finally stumbled back to the hatch, Harris collapsed against the wall, sobbing. His lantern sputtered, oil nearly spent, and in its last flicker, I saw his reflection in the water below. Only it wasn't him. Its eyes tracked me, not him. And when the flame died completely, that smile bloomed across its face, luminous even in the dark. I backed away, heart slamming against my ribs, but Clark only shook his head, jaw trembling as he muttered, "Don't look, don't ever look." And then, just before we left, the pool rippled one last time. Not from our steps, not from air, but from something rising just beneath the surface, waiting for the next lantern to fall. After the incident at the pool, I thought I had finally glimpsed the bottom of our nightmare, but I was wrong. Clark reminded us of the next law as we stripped off our soaked boots, his hands trembling, though he tried to hide it. He said it without looking at us, his gaze fixed on the dripping tunnel behind. Rule 7. Never respond if you hear your own voice calling from the dark. The words didn't make sense at first, but the weight in his tone told me this was not a warning to be taken lightly. We sat in the break room, soaked clothes clinging to our skin, Harris shivering in silence. He wouldn't lift his eyes from the floor. I was about to ask Clark what he meant when Harris flinched violently, knocking over his tin mug. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We froze. The only sound was the groan of metal and distant lap of water. But Harris insisted he'd heard something, his own voice calling his name from the corridor outside. Clark snapped at him to shut up, but the damage was done. My skin crawled, because Harris's face was drained of all color. He believed it, and belief was enough down here. That night, sleep never came. I lay on my cot listening to the creak of steel and the drip 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 of water, seeping through the walls. Then faintly, I heard it. My own voice. It was impossible, yet unmistakable. A low echo, stretching down the hall, calling my name in the exact cadence I use when I'm tired or annoyed. My blood turned to ice. The urge to respond, to shout "what?" clawed at my throat. It felt instinctual, almost forced, like something was pressing down on my chest, urging me to obey. But Clark's warning drilled into me. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. The call came again, closer this time, clearer. It was me, but not. A subtle distortion, as though the words were hollow, drained of life, puppeted. My cot rattled as I clenched the frame, terrified the sound would coax a reply out of me in my sleep. Across the room, Harris whimpered, whispering, "Stop it, stop it." Clark rose like a shadow, moving toward him, and clamped a hand over Harris's mouth. His eyes darted to me, wide and furious. That silent command was clear, "Don't say a word." The voice didn't stop. It circled the barracks, drifting between us, calling each of our names in turn. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes a perfect mimicry, sometimes stretched into a grotesque parody that gurgled like drowning. When it called Clark's name, I swore I saw his jaw tighten, the muscle twitching like he wanted to answer, but he didn't. He stood still as stone until the echoes faded, leaving us drenched in sweat and silence. The next morning, Harris wouldn't eat. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips cracked, his hands trembling as though he hadn't slept in years. When Clark tried to hand him bread, Harris shoved it away and hissed, "It knows me. It's trying to get me alone." Clark didn't argue. That scared me more than anything. If Clark believed the thing could know us, then maybe it already did. Later, during maintenance checks, Harris lagged behind. I heard him muttering under his breath, too low to catch. When I called out, he jerked upright and swore he hadn't said anything. But then, God help me, I heard his voice again, from the tunnel ahead. Same tone, same pitch, calling my name. Only Harris was standing right beside me. My throat closed. He looked at me, horrified, because he'd heard it too. Clark shoved us forward, barking that if we stopped moving, we'd never start again. The tunnel stretched endless, lantern light flickering against rust and salt. The voice kept pace with us. Sometimes behind, sometimes ahead, sometimes whispering directly at my ear, though no one was there. My lantern shook, shadows flaring wildly, and for a split second I saw movement crawling along the walls, figures half-formed, their mouths opening and closing in silence, like they were rehearsing the words before speaking. We reached the pump chamber, and that's when Harris broke. The voice called his name, his full name, middle and all, in the exact tone his mother used. He gasped, staggered forward, and before Clark or I could stop him, he shouted back, "I'm here," the chamber answered. The echo that followed wasn't natural. It didn't bounce back from the walls. It came from the water itself. The black surface rippled as though sound had weight, carrying Harris's words down into its depths. Then, in perfect clarity, his voice answered him from below. "I know." The sound slithered up my spine, cold and wet, like fingers pressing against the base of my skull. Harris froze, lantern clattering from his grip into the water. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then something laughed. It was his laugh. The pool rippled, and dozens of distorted faces rose just beneath the surface. Every one of them Harris. Twisted smiles, bloated eyes, some with jaws unhinged, others with lips sewn shut by strands of kelp. They all stared at him, mocking him with his own voice. Harris screamed, clawing at his ears, backing against the wall. Clark bellowed at me to grab him, but I couldn't move. My legs were locked, my breath a strangled rasp. One of the reflections broke free, rising up from the water, half-formed but solid enough to lunge. Clark tackled Harris, dragging him back, just as the mimic slammed against the bulkhead with a splash. Its body dissolved instantly, splattering brine across the chamber, but the laughter lingered. Harris sobbed, thrashing against Clark's grip, insisting they knew him, that they wanted him. Clark shook him violently, growling that if he ever answered again, we'd all be dead. But even as Clark shouted, I heard it, my voice. Low, calm, steady. It called from behind me, whispering a word I hadn't spoken aloud in years. My sister's name. My blood froze. I hadn't told anyone about her, not even Clark. My lantern flickered, shadows curling like smoke, and the voice whispered again, closer this time, "Come see me." I clenched my jaw until my teeth ached, refusing to speak. Clark's eyes met mine, and I knew he'd heard it too. The thing wasn't just mimicking anymore. It was learning. It was listening. And then Harris screamed. We spun to see him staring into the black water, his face lit by its glow. His mouth hung open, and a perfect copy of his own voice was rising from the pool, echoing him word for word, syllable for syllable. Only when it finished repeating him, it kept going, adding words he hadn't spoken, stringing them together into sentences. It spoke his fears. It spoke his secrets. And then, finally, it spoke mine. The pool whispered my sister's name again. This time, it sounded exactly like her. Clark didn't waste time after the mimicry at the pool. He dragged Harris back by the collar, snarling orders through gritted teeth. His voice cracked when he repeated the next command. The one burned deepest into the station's laws. Rule 8. Never let the lights go out, no matter what you hear in the dark. The words hit harder than any of the others. The way he spoke them made me realize this wasn't just about staying sane. It was about survival. I wanted to ask why, but the station answered for me. The overhead lamps flickered once, just once, but the effect was immediate. Harris shrieked, wrenching free of Clark's grip, while every pipe and panel around us seemed to groan in unison. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, smearing across the walls like oil. I swear they moved with intent. Clark barked at me to keep the lanterns high, to never let the glow falter, and I obeyed without hesitation. We stumbled back toward the main barracks, dragging Harris between us. The corridor lights buzzed angrily overhead, dimming in intervals that seemed too deliberate, as if something was pressing against the current, starving us of light inch by inch. My heart slammed against my ribs. Every time the lamps dipped, the air grew colder, heavier. I thought I saw figures in the dark edges of the hallway, half-formed silhouettes crouched low, waiting. When we finally reached the barracks, Clark lit every lamp, every lantern, every emergency flare he could get his hands on. The room blazed like an oven, heat radiating off the flames until sweat poured down our faces. Harris cowered in the corner, muttering to himself, his eyes darting to every shadow. The light didn't comfort him. Nothing did anymore. I wasn't sure if it comforted me either, because the longer I stared, the more I felt the darkness pressing against it, hungry and patient. That night, no one slept. Clark stayed at the table, sharpening a blade over and over, his jaw clenched tight. I sat by the lanterns, feeding them oil, staring at the glow until my eyes blurred. At one point, Harris lifted his head and whispered, "Do you hear it?" I shook mine, though deep down I did. Faint scratching from beyond the bulkhead, the scrape of nails or claws dragging across steel. The scratching grew louder as the hours dragged on. At times it sounded like it was moving through the vents, slithering closer. Then came the whispers, soft at first, but growing. They weren't mimicking us this time. They were begging, pleading for us to put the lights out. Promises hissed through the walls, voices layered atop one another. "It's safe here. You'll see, just snuff the flame, and we'll show you." Harris cracked first. His eyes glazed over as the voices called him. He crawled toward the nearest lantern, muttering that it was too hot, too bright, that he couldn't breathe. Clark caught him mid-reach, slamming him against the wall. "Do you want them in here?" Clark roared, his voice trembling. Harris sobbed, clawing at his ears, insisting they only wanted to talk. Clark hit him, hard, just to shut him up. The sound of knuckles against bone echoed sharper than any scream. After that, we took shifts. One of us always awake, always watching the flames. My shift came in the dead hours, when even the ocean outside seemed to still. That was when the lights began to falter again. A low hum filled the barracks, the bulbs overhead flickering violently, glass rattling in their sockets. My lantern's flame wavered, thinning as though the air itself had been stolen. In that dying light, I saw them. Not reflections, not shadows, things, dozens of them, pressed against the walls and ceiling, their forms writhing like smoke given weight. Some had limbs too long, bending wrong, faces split with two wide mouths grinning in silence. Others were only outlines, suggestions of bodies that might once have been human, but hollowed out, empty. They pulsed at the edges of the light, never stepping fully in, but always pushing closer when the glow weakened. My hands shook as I fed more oil into the lantern, flames sputtering, nearly dying. The moment it steadied, the things retreated a fraction, seething at the border. One pressed its face close to the glass, its skin translucent, and mouthed words I couldn't hear. I looked away, afraid that if I tried to read its lips, I'd understand. By morning, Harris was gone. Clark and I woke to silence. The corner where Harris had been empty, except for the smear of blood across the floor, leading to the door. The lamps were still lit, every flame strong, which meant he'd left willingly. He'd snuffed his own lantern. Clark cursed, slamming his fist against the wall, but neither of us spoke the truth. Harris hadn't been dragged out. He had followed. We searched, though we knew it was hopeless. The corridors twisted endlessly, lit in weak orange where our lanterns reached. The shadows pressed tight around us, whispering his name, mocking us with his voice. At one point, I thought I saw him just ahead, standing barefoot in the tunnel, skin pale and eyes wide. I nearly called out before Clark yanked me back, snarling that it wasn't him. The figure dissolved as the light swayed, vanishing like smoke. By the time we returned to the barracks, Clark's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He tried to relight the lamps again, but they were already burning. His paranoia had reached its peak, mine too. I couldn't stop glancing at the corners, where the shadows seemed thicker, pulsing as though alive. Every flicker of flame sent terror through me, the thought of darkness unbearable. That night, the voices changed. They no longer begged us to put out the lights. They commanded it. Harsh guttural tones tore through the steel, words that vibrated in my chest like the rumble of a storm. The lamps flared violently, nearly bursting. Clark clutched his blade, like it was the only anchor to reality. I sat frozen, watching the flames gutter, knowing the moment one died, they would flood in. And then something shifted. The voices stopped. The scratching, the whispers, the pressure in the walls all gone. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. My chest loosened, a breath escaping that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Clark's shoulders sagged. Maybe, just maybe, the night had passed. That's when every lamp went out at once. The darkness slammed into us like a living thing, heavy and suffocating, swallowing every trace of light. My scream caught in my throat as dozens of shapes surged forward, their bodies blotting out what little glow lingered in my eyes. I felt claws graze my arm, breath against my neck, cold hands brushing my face, and somewhere in the black, Harris's voice whispered, "Now you see." When the lamps died, Clark screamed at me to stay still. His voice was hoarse, desperate, carrying the weight of law. Rule 9. If you lose the light, do not move until it returns. He was somewhere in the dark with me, though I couldn't see him. Not a single outline, not a flicker of flame. Only the sound of his ragged breath convinced me he was close. The rules had always sounded like superstition before, a way to keep us in line, to enforce discipline in a place that tested sanity. But now, in the total black, I understood. The moment I shifted even slightly, brushing my boot against the metal grating, the darkness moved. Not the absence of light, the darkness itself. It surged like water, a ripple of weightless bodies pressing closer. I froze, terrified that even the beat of my heart might count as movement. I held my breath, listening. The silence wasn't silence at all. Beneath the ringing in my ears, I could hear them. Dozens, no, hundreds, shifting just out of reach, their forms scraping and sliding against the walls. Some clicked, their joints snapping like broken glass, while others whispered in half-formed sentences. The words made no sense, but the cadence was familiar. Human, hungry. Clark hissed my name, warning me again not to move. His voice shook, yet he didn't falter. I clung to his words like a lifeline. I wanted to crawl toward him, to close the gap, but I remembered the rule. Movement was invitation. Movement was permission. So I stood there in the void, sweat dripping down my spine, legs trembling with strain, praying for even a single spark of light. Then the darkness tested me. Something brushed my hand, cold, slick, wet like the belly of a fish dragged across my skin. I bit down a cry. Another touch grazed my ankle, feather light but deliberate. My instinct screamed to jerk away, but I locked my knees, forcing myself into stillness. If I moved, I knew it would be over. The things pressed tighter around me, their unseen weight bending the air, pressing into my ears until they popped. The voices began again, softer now, intimate. They spoke with the cadence of people I'd loved, voices stolen from memory. My father, my sister, even Harris, who had been dragged into the dark. Each one begged me to step forward, to reach out, to follow. They swore they could guide me back to safety, that Clark had lied, that the rules weren't real. For a heartbeat, I wanted to believe. The ache in my muscles, the sting in my lungs from holding my breath, the terror of not knowing, all of it begged for release. But Clark's voice cut through, low and harsh. Don't you listen to them. They're not yours. Minutes stretched like hours. My calves cramped. My fingers went numb from clenching the lantern's handle, though no flame remained within it. Every nerve screamed to flee, to move, to do anything other than stand in suffocating black. But I endured, because the alternative was worse. I felt it, like a shark circling, just beyond visibility, waiting for me to twitch. Finally, a spark flared. Clark had struck a match. The faint sulfur glow painted his face, pale and haggard, eyes wide with terror. For a brief instant, I saw them behind him, shapes lining the corridor wall, hunched and twitching, retreating as the light kissed their forms. They melted into the dark, vanishing like smoke in the wind. My knees nearly buckled, but Clark grabbed my arm, steadying me. The match burned fast, scorching his fingers before he lit a lantern with the dying flame. The moment the glow bloomed, the barracks shifted. The things were gone. No scratching, no whispers, no breath against my neck. Just silence, too heavy to be natural. Clark slumped, shoulders sagging, relief warring with exhaustion. We didn't speak for a long time. The rule had saved us, and we both knew it. But it had cost us too. Harris was gone. The station was thinning, rule by rule, stripping away the unprepared. How many more would fall before we reached the end? Later, Clark told me something that made my stomach turn. They don't always wait for you to move, he whispered, eyes fixed on the flickering flame. Sometimes they test the boundaries. They push, they lean in, they wait for weakness. Stillness keeps you alive, but only just. That night, I learned what he meant. We tried to rest, lanterns burning, but exhaustion pulled me under. I woke to darkness again. One of the lanterns had gone out, its oil drained. Only one remained lit. Clark slept beside it, knife clutched to his chest. I sat frozen, my body trembling. The dark pressed closer, thick and heavy, and then a sound. Not whispers this time. Breathing, right against my ear. Slow, deliberate, in perfect sync with mine. I stayed still. I had to. My entire body screamed to whip around, to shove whatever it was away, but I obeyed the rule. The breath grew louder, hotter, until I could feel moisture on my skin. My heart hammered, blood roaring in my ears. And then in the barest whisper, it said my name. The lantern flared. The presence vanished. Clark stirred awake, asking if I was okay. I couldn't answer. My throat was raw, my body stiff as stone. I hadn't moved. I had survived. But I understood now. The darkness wasn't just waiting. It was hunting. And every second without light was another chance for it to learn how to break me. We made it through the night, but barely. By morning, Clark's hands shook so badly, he spilled half our oil trying to refill the lanterns. Supplies were dwindling. Each rule was harder to follow than the last. And somewhere deep inside, I feared the truth. The rules weren't protections, they were bargains. Thin lines drawn between us and the things that ruled this trench. And every time we leaned on them, the lines grew thinner. But we had no choice. We obeyed. And as I stared into the fading flame that morning, I realized something chilling. The rules weren't written to keep the darkness out. They were written to keep us in. Clark told me this one with a look in his eyes I had never seen before. Not just fear, but recognition. He leaned close to the last lantern's glow and whispered Rule 10. Never trust the voices that sound like your own. At the time, I thought he meant the whispers we'd been hearing in the dark, the mimicry of people we loved. But I was wrong. This rule wasn't about them pretending to be others. It was about when they stopped pretending altogether. The first time I heard it, I was alone. Clark had gone to check the supply hatch, and I was left in the barracks with the lantern. The silence was thick, humming in my ears. I tried to steady my breath, to count, to keep calm. Then from just beyond the reach of the light, I heard a voice. My voice. Don't move. The words were sharp, urgent, almost overlapping with my own thoughts. I spun instinctively, the lantern swaying, shadows jerking along the walls. Nothing, no one. But the voice came again, clearer this time. They'll see you if you move the light. Don't let it flicker. It wasn't Clark. It wasn't Harris. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was me, my exact tone, my cadence, the private rhythm of words I'd spoken in my head 1,000 times before. Hearing it outside of myself was like looking into a mirror and finding the reflection smiling when I wasn't. I froze, every instinct demanding I listen. The voice had a confidence I lacked. It felt like guidance, like a part of me that knew the truth of this place. I nearly obeyed. But then Clark's warning rang in my skull. Never trust the voices that sound like your own. I shut my eyes, gripping the lantern until my knuckles whitened. The voice didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, wrapping around me like a whisper from inside my skull. You're wasting your time with him. Clark will fail you. He doesn't understand. I understand. I am you. I bit down hard on my tongue, using pain to anchor myself. The voice hissed with irritation, almost like it felt my resistance. Then it laughed. My laugh, cold, broken, hollow. Clark returned just as I felt the first crack in my resolve. I didn't tell him what I heard, not at first. But he looked at my face, pale and trembling, and he knew. He didn't ask questions. He only refilled the lantern and muttered, "It's starting for you too." That night, the rule showed its true teeth. We tried to sleep in shifts, one watching the light while the other rested. But exhaustion caught us both, and at some point, I slipped into half-dream. I don't remember closing my eyes, but suddenly I was standing in the barracks with no lantern. Darkness pressed in, heavy as water, and in that blackness, my voice spoke. It told me to walk, to step forward, to trust it. I moved. Only when my boot scraped against metal grating did I jolt awake, heart pounding, lantern still glowing beside me. Clark slept a few feet away, but the position of my body told the truth. I had risen in my sleep, compelled by something wearing my voice. My chest ached with terror. I hadn't moved willingly, but I had moved, and the dark had noticed. The next day, Clark confronted me. He said he'd woken in the night and seen me standing, eyes wide open, whispering to myself. Only it wasn't myself. I was repeating after the voice. My voice. He shook me violently until I collapsed, gasping, unaware of what I'd done. He told me that was how Harris had gone. He hadn't disobeyed a rule out of fear or carelessness. He had obeyed a voice that wasn't his, though it sounded exactly like him. Step by step, it had led him into the dark. That revelation broke something in me. The rules weren't just barriers against external threats. They were defenses against infiltration. The trench wasn't just filled with creatures outside of us. It was working its way in, weaving through our memories, learning our voices, until we couldn't tell ourselves apart from it. Days bled together after that. Oil dwindled, food spoiled, the air turned sour with damp metal and mold. Clark grew quieter, withdrawn, muttering under his breath. I couldn't tell if he was reciting the rules or answering the voice. Then it happened again. While watching the lantern one night, I heard it, not from the dark this time, but directly from my own mouth. I hadn't meant to speak, but the words tumbled out anyway. Blow it out, just for a second. You need to know. The sound was mine, but the intent wasn't. My jaw locked, my throat clenched, but the words tried to force their way free, shaping themselves without my permission. Clark stirred, and I snapped my teeth shut, blood trickling where I bit my tongue. He didn't wake fully, thank God. If he'd heard, I don't know what he would have done. The rule was clear: voices that sounded like your own could not be trusted. But what if the trench didn't just mimic? What if it replaced? That thought haunted me more than the whispers, more than the shapes in the dark. Because if I couldn't trust my own voice, then what was left of me? The final straw came when the voice used my secrets. It spoke of things no one else knew: childhood memories, failures, regrets. It mocked me with them, telling me I didn't deserve survival, that Clark didn't either, that the trench would take us both, but it had chosen me to go first. I almost believed it, almost, but I remembered the rule. I clung to it like a lifeline, whispering over and over in my head, never trust the voices that sound like your own. The longer I resisted, the angrier it became. My voice warped, cracking, stretching, until it didn't sound human anymore. The last time I heard it that night, it didn't sound like me at all. It sounded like something wearing me like a mask, laughing at the fragile human shape it had stolen. I sat there in the glow of the lantern, teeth clenched, nails digging into my palms, until they drew blood, and I realized something horrifying. The rules weren't about beating the trench, they were about lasting long enough to delay being claimed by it. And with every passing day, every rule followed, every shadow endured. I felt myself slipping closer to the point where I wouldn't recognize the difference between me and the voice. This was the last thing Clark ever told me. His voice was barely a rasp. His lips cracked and pale, but his eyes burned with the weight of it. Rule 11. If you forget the rules, the trench will remember you. At first, I thought he meant it figuratively, that the rules were a kind of discipline, a way of keeping our minds intact. But I learned quickly that he wasn't speaking in metaphor. The trench doesn't forgive forgetfulness. It waits for it. The descent into forgetting is gradual. Exhaustion dulls the edges of thought. Hunger makes your memories thin. Fear shakes your concentration loose until the rules start slipping through the cracks. The first one I forgot was small. I let the lantern dim for too long before trimming the wick. Nothing happened immediately, but when the shadows bent against the wall, I felt them watching, patient, like predators who'd scented a wound. I scrambled to recover, whispering the earlier rules in my head, forcing myself to repeat them until my voice shook, but the damage was done. A single slip, a single breach of memory, and the trench had marked me. I could feel it pressing closer. Clark warned me about this stage. He said the rules weren't just instructions, they were incantations. Each one spoken, each one remembered, built a barrier. The moment I forgot, even for a heartbeat, that barrier cracked, and the trench doesn't need much, only a crack. It started showing in my dreams. I would see the rules scrawled across walls of rusted metal, scratched into the backs of my eyelids. Only when I tried to read them, they twisted. Letters rearranged themselves. Numbers skipped. Rule 3 became Rule 8. Rule 7 became Rule 2. No matter how many times I repeated them, they slid away like oil on water. One night, I woke to find my voice mumbling rules out of order, wrong and broken, as though the trench was rewriting them through me. Clark grabbed me by the shoulders, shook me, screamed in my face until I could recite them again properly. His panic was worse than the dark. He wasn't just afraid for me, he was afraid of me, because once the trench remembers you, you stop being human to the others. You're compromised. You're already gone, whether you know it or not. The proof came the night Clark forgot. He was strong, sharper than I'd ever been, but even he was only a man. Fatigue carved into him, carving the rules out of his memory one by one. He muttered them, clutched them like prayer beads. But when the lantern sputtered and he failed to relight it in time, something moved in. I watched his eyes glaze, watched his lips form words that weren't his. He didn't scream. He just looked at me with hollow recognition and whispered, "It's your turn now." Then he walked into the shadows, calm as if he'd been waiting for it. I didn't follow. I couldn't. By then, I knew what waited in the dark wasn't Clark anymore. After that, I was alone. Alone with the rules. Alone with the trench pressing closer with every flicker of the lantern. And that's when I realized the final cruelty. The rules don't save you. They never did. They only prolong the inevitable. They give you structure, something to cling to while the trench gnaws at your mind. But they aren't walls. They're delaying tactics. They're distractions. Because the moment you falter, the trench remembers. And once it remembers, it doesn't let go. I try to repeat them still, whispering through cracked lips, voice raw, mind unraveling. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 3, but they slip now, tangling in my throat. Sometimes I hear myself reciting them wrong, and I don't know whether it's me or the voice wearing me like a mask. Sometimes I forget entire rules until something scratches at the edge of the lantern's glow, and only then do I remember, but too late, always too late. And sometimes I think I hear Clark's voice, or Harris's, or my own, telling me the rules don't matter anymore, that I should let go. That forgetting isn't failure, it's surrender. But I can't. I won't. Because if I forget the rules, the trench will remember me, and I've seen what that means. I've seen what it makes of men. I've heard the laughter in the dark, the echo of myself where I shouldn't be. And now I don't know if I'm writing this to remind myself, or to warn whoever finds it next, because the trench always remembers, and it's waiting for you too.